Dylan Guenther, with his second straight overtime game winner, is red hot. And what will we see on the trade front during the Four Nations break? We've got all that and a lot more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to the Friday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. I'm Gil Martin from Locked On Islanders. I'm here every Friday with Rachel Donner of Locked On Flyers. Rachel, this is a little bit of a strange Friday as we are almost at the break here for the Four Nations tournament. Going to be weird without NHL hockey specifically for about a week and a half to 2 weeks.
It is, but I'm very excited because I am going to Boston to cover the games for the Four Nations tournament that will be held there, including the finals. So I am very excited about that.
Very, very nice, and enjoy that. And another person who is very excited lately, Dylan Guenther of the Utah Hockey Club, comes off the injured list and gets back-to-back overtime game winners. Number one, big for Dylan Guenther, but number two, Utah really needed these two wins to sort of get back on track.
Yeah, they'd been on a 5-game losing streak. Now they've won 2 in a row. They're still 6 points out of a wild card spot here, so very unlikely they'll make the playoffs, but at least they're making an effort here, right?
Yeah, and last night the dramatic game winner with a little more than 30 seconds left in overtime, and Guenther comes up big.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the Flyers were victims of his first overtime winner of the week on Tuesday. That was his first game back, and he hadn't played since January 8th, and he had suffered a lower body injury after getting hit by Alexander Barkov in a game against the Florida Panthers. And so coming back in a little under a month was, pretty accelerated timeline there, but it was good to see that he was back. 2 goals and an assist in that game on Tuesday against the Flyers. He was all over the place. I mean, to be fair, if you'd been out a month, you're probably pretty excited to be back in the game, and you're going to be just, doing absolutely everything to contribute and show you're ready to be back in the lineup, right?
Oh, yeah, and he did that. I mean, look, 6 shots on goal against the Flyers, 2 goals and an assist, and then 7 shots on goal against Columbus. He's been involved, let's put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, this 2-game performance is a small window, but I think it provides a lot of insight into, what he can contribute to this team moving forward, as well as kind of the overarching plans of the Utah Hockey Club in terms of building from this, young base here, right?
Yeah, and that is their overall plan, and Guenther, a former first-round pick, is a big part of that. And the good thing is, this is his 3rd NHL season. He's still a young guy. I mean, he's
21, right?
21. He can, he's only been able to legally buy a drink for 11 months right now. So, not even. So, and yet here he is. He's only played 42 games this year because of the injuries that you mentioned. He's already got a career-high 19 goals, a career-high 38 points. I think we're seeing the maturation and the progress being made by Dylan Guenther almost like right before our eyes.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think his all-around game is getting a lot better as well. You mentioned his point totals this year or his goal totals. 38 points so far this season in 42 games. Last season, in its entirety for the Arizona Coyotes, he had 35 points in 45 games. So he's already exceeded it in fewer games played, which I think is a sign of progress. And he's being used in more prominent roles, that's for sure, this year. But he was on the third line for a while. I think he'll end up moving up overall as his career progresses. But the other thing is that I think his two-way game is getting a little bit better, right? I think he's making fewer mistakes. I think defensively he's a little bit better than he was last year. Take plus minus what you will, but he was a negative in his first two seasons, and right now he's sitting at a +7, which is pretty solid.
Yeah, it is. And he's also, it's funny you mentioned the more prominent role, and yet his ice time, he's only playing 25 seconds per game more this year than he did a year ago, but he's just being more productive, and 5 game-winning goals in 42 games for a team that is right around NHL 500. That's very impressive to be able to be that clutch guy that when your team wins, you are very often right in the middle of that.
Yeah, and Utah, as we know, is a little bit of a streaky team, right? And so when you have guys like him that can play a little bit more consistently and produce more consistently in the long run, that's when a team can take that next step, right?
Yeah, you need those guys who are going to be there game in and game out. And look, the schedule doesn't get any easier for Utah. They're on this road trip. They close out the weekend against Carolina and Washington. It's going to be interesting to see how they handle those back-to-back road matinees heading into the Four Nations break.
Yeah, that Carolina Washington 2 games in a row, oof, that
Yeah.
is going to be very, very difficult, but I don't think it's, like, insurmountable. And, again, having watched this team pretty recently and knowing, as you and I both know, like, the Metro game is much different than the style of play out west. It's so much more of a track meet, and that's, like, one of the things that Utah was able to do against the Flyers is create a lot more openness out there just because of the faster track meet style of play versus of a more grinding east-west, defensive first kind of style that the Metro division has. And again, I've seen Washington very recently as well, and the Flyers did really well. Like, I know the Caps won, but the Flyers did really well holding Washington to a limited number of shots and clogged up the neutral zone. So it's possible. It's just like, do these styles of play align? But I think Dylan Guenther is one of those players that could probably play well in both of those kinds of environments.
Yeah, and that's why he was drafted as high as he was, and why everyone is so encouraged by this recent streak. And I just am enjoying watching him develop into a really good NHL player. And as far as Utah goes, they are still a young team, and I think that's part of the reason why we see a 5-game losing streak and then a winning streak and then a losing streak. The consistency isn't there
Mhm.
yet for this young team, and that's the next step. And if they want to make a run, you mentioned they're 6 points out of a wild card as of right now. If they want to make a run, they've got to get more consistent down the stretch, and they're going to need some of these younger players to grow into their roles and play more consistent hockey.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's gonna be a big part of it there. And, we'll see if, he continues his, point streak and goal streak in the next few games and helps lifts this team up.
Yeah, any idea at this point why they're a better road team than a home team in Utah?
I don't know. I think it's really maybe they just got so used to play from the Arizona holdover of their home ice wasn't really a home ice. So maybe
Right.
that has something to do with it.
Yeah.
But and getting used to a new home, right?
Right.
So
Yeah, it's not as big
there's
an
that.
advantage when you're not as familiar with the rink as everybody else is. So, yeah,
Yeah.
no question about that. Well, we have got a lot more to discuss on today's show. Four Nations, the break starts in a couple of days. Will there be trades during Four Nations? How will they handle the break? And will players who are playing in Four Nations also potentially be moved, or will that be sort of a stop sign because they're in the tournament? We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
Looking for tickets to your next big event, whether it's a concert, a comedy show, or a sports game, finding the right ticket at the right price can be a headache. But with Game Time Picks, it's never been easier. Let me tell you how it works. The app does the hard work for you. Game Time Picks curates the best deals, so you don't have to waste time searching through endless ticket listings. I've been using Game Time Picks for a while now, and their seat view feature is a game changer. Before I hit buy, I can see exactly what my seat will look like in the venue, which is so reassuring because sightlines are so important to me. And the best part, you're covered with Game Time's lowest price guarantee. If you find a better deal somewhere else, they'll refund 110% of the difference. Plus, your tickets are guaranteed to be delivered on time with easy cancellation options if something comes up. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem with the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
So, Four Nations, just a few days away right now. The break starts after this weekend. Uh, First of all, your thoughts about just having this break. Let's start with that. What is this 12-day break going to mean for teams around the league?
Well, for me personally, it's not really a break because I'm going to Boston to cover the
Right.
games. But yeah, I think it is interesting because it does set them up for what next year is going to look like with the Olympics and having the sort of games crunched in January a little bit and having a lot of games. There's been so much wear and tear, and as we've seen on these Four Nations rosters, and the shows have been talking about all week, with our colleagues there, we've had to see roster changes because of injuries, and the injuries are more likely to come up when you play more games, right?
Yep.
So I think there's a lot of like healing that is going to take place. A lot of just like, people who are banged up, people who block a lot of shots. Like, I think that's going to be the most important thing for the guys not playing in the tournament.
And then there are the guys who won't get a break, who are playing in the tournament. Do you think we're going to see physical hockey in this tournament? Will there be a lot of checking? I don't expect we see an all-star game where it's just guys skating up and down the ice, but I don't think we're going to see a typical NHL game either.
No, it's definitely going to be somewhere in the middle for sure. I think we'll see some really strong checks now and again, in times of desperation, but I don't think anybody wants to get hurt during
No.
this tournament.
No, I agree with that. No doubt. And I'm looking forward to the tournament, seeing how this all plays out. But there's one little caveat here. There's no roster freeze during
No.
Four Nations like there is over the holiday break or at other times in the year. So you could trade somebody, you could send somebody down to the minors. Uh, what do you think we're going to see over this time period? How will teams handle it?
Well, it's been interesting, right? So if we look back at, the last starting like a week ago, that previous week where we had I think 5 pretty significant trades that went down in this sort of mini trade deadline leading up to Four Nations here. We had the big Mikko Rantanen deal going to the Hurricanes. We had the Flyers Flames trade with Kuzmenko and Peltier going to the Flyers, with Joel Farabee and Morgan Frost going to the Flames. Then finally, the Canucks situation got handled, with JT Miller is going to the Rangers. And then Vancouver used the pick they got from the Rangers to pick up Marcus Pettersson from the Pens, who they've now extended onto a longer term deal. They also got Drew O'Connor, who wound up scoring the penalty shot in overtime to win the game for them. So
Yeah.
that's working out for them so far.
So far.
I would say, right? So then we also had the Dallas Stars San Jose Sharks deal, right? With Michael Granlund and Cody Ceci going to the Stars for some picks. So, like, pretty significant transactions already taking place around the league. And I think, people want to kind of know what they have and have those guys settled before this break. So people are kind of going into their break knowing what the situation is leading up to the home stretch of the season, don't you think?
Yeah, and look, obviously I think what Four Nations did was create a second unofficial trade deadline where people figured they wanted to get the new guys integrated as soon as possible. If players were going to play in Four Nations, if you're going to trade them, you don't want them to get hurt. So before the Four Nations tournament, so you may want to trade them before then or risk losing them for nothing or seeing their value go way down. So it has almost created a second trade deadline that I don't think under normal circumstances we would have seen all this movement 6 weeks, 5 weeks before the trade deadline.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I feel like, yes, that is absolutely something that took place, but also I feel like these trades are happening earlier year over year.
Yeah.
And because I think people have recognized that maybe you don't, I mean, the Rantanen deal aside, I think, which was a really fascinating deal that kind of kicked off this week long flurry of big trades, where you don't necessarily want to be the first deal on the block, but you don't want to be the last one either picking up scraps. So you want to be in that sweet spot, right in the middle, right? Where you're like the second, third big deal of the trade deadline. So you can probably get more bang for your buck because the price goes up as the deadline gets closer, right?
Supply and demand.
Right. Exactly. So I think people just wanted to take advantage of that and be the earlier deal so they could get a better price, I think, in the grand scheme of things. And it's part of this overall trend. But the Four Nations kind of added an extra element into it to encourage that trend to maybe expand a little further.
Yeah, I think that's right. It just sort of put a landmark that, we have to deal with this, and then everything changes, and then we have the break, and then we get back to the last few weeks before the trade deadline. And, here we go, getting into this tournament right now. Do you think that we're more likely to see players who are in the tournament be traded or players who are not in the tournament be traded during this break?
Yeah, it should be interesting because, like you said, there is no like free roster freeze during the tournament. Teams do have to remain cap compliant, and waiver rules still apply. All of that is still in place, but I think I think teams are going to make the best deal for themselves. And the only wrench I see in there is that, like, normally, and we saw this with the Flames Flyers deal because of the timing of the deal relative to the fact that both teams were playing that night and both teams were short, so they couldn't pull the guys. So each team had people involved in the trade playing in the games
Right.
the night the deal. Normally you would pull a guy, right? If he's getting
Yeah.
traded. And can you pull a guy from Four Nations for getting
Yeah,
traded?
and would they? And didn't the Flyers pull a
No.
guy mid-game against the Islanders? They literally just sat a player for the rest of the game after the trade was going to be put through?
It was against the Flames. They I think they were thinking about it, but Morgan Frost actually got banged up a little bit. But
Okay.
but but he was fine, and so the trade went through. But Joel Farabee played for the remainder of the game, and he was involved.
Right,
So,
but Frost came off, but I was not aware that he was banged.
he was pulled off because he was banged up, and they, out of precaution because of the trade, didn't
Right,
let him go back in the game.
right. Unbelievable. Well, it's going to be interesting. We've got a lot more to discuss with regard to Four Nations and possible trades and rumors. We're going to get to that coming up next. So we're getting very close to Four Nations. It's going to start next week, and it's an exciting time for the hockey world. But first of all, do you think we're going to see some teams send players down to the AHL for cap purposes and to let them play some games during this break?
Yeah, I think depending on who they are and what the circumstances are, especially if it's guys that have been getting scratched, right? If they're young players that maybe aren't getting as much ice time, if they're on their ELC or there's a two-way deal where they're waiver exempt, I think it's going to be pretty easy to send them down and either have them play or have them not play, depending on what their situation is. Do they need to rest up or not? But you can absolutely do that, and it saves a little bit of cap money that you can bank over the break as well. So I do think teams will take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think we will see some of that at different points, and it makes sense. And I think for some young guys who are black aces, getting scratched, it makes sense to let them play a few games and stay sharp, because you never know when, if they get recalled, that they'll be needed for a game or two here or there.
Yeah, and some of the guys don't technically have to report according to league rules. So, if there's a player that is loaned to the AHL team anytime after midnight on the day of their team's final game before the break, they don't have to report until after the break formally ends. So it's kind of like there's no roster freeze, but it's also a break time. It's this
Right.
weird middle ground here.
Yeah, it's a little odd, and we'll see how this all ends up playing out. It's going to be interesting. Are there any players you think who might be moved during this break?
Well, I think, like we talked about, I think it's very unlikely that anybody involved in Four Nations gets traded. I think it just seems like unnecessarily cruel, especially when there is a whole block of time after Four Nations before the deadline that those trades can take place. Now, could it take place immediately after the Four Nations tournament and before that team's games start up again? Maybe.
Right.
Maybe some trades will happen in that very short window, but I think the likelihood of anybody involved getting traded is slim to none. Now, not involved
Yeah.
could be, and there's always trade rumors around. I think most of them involve the Toronto Maple Leafs because the Leafs think they're getting everybody and they're going to sell high on Max Domi for some reason. But you know, I do think there are additional trades that will happen and potentially big ones before the deadline.
Any players you think that specifically might be highly likely to move?
Well, this is where the Buffalo Sabres problem comes into play here because they're on a tremendous winning streak here. For
Oops.
this team is I know. This team is so stressful. They've won 4 games in a row now, and they've kind of played themselves almost out of a top 5 pick in the draft at the moment. They're kind of hanging on to that by a thread here, but at the same time, Dylan Cousins has been a name that's been out there for months. at this point as a big trade piece that could potentially be a huge windfall for Buffalo. And I think it would be a mistake not to consider those potential trades.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think Cousins is likely to be moved before the deadline. I mean, look, even after this 4-game win streak, they're 12 points out of a wild card with like 8 teams that they would need to pass to get there. So Buffalo is most likely going to be sellers, and Cousins would probably be their most desirable asset at this point.
Yeah, I really do. I just think it's important that the Sabres set themselves up for the future here.
Yeah, I think that makes the most sense. Any other players out there that you think could be on the move during this break?
I mean, we've seen some rumors recently about Braden Shen in St. Louis. Now, St. Louis is, I think, also a very interesting team in the Buffalo vein, where they're just hanging on long enough and well enough that, they should be sellers, but at the same time, maybe they won't be just because of how close they are, right?
Yeah, there's a few teams, I'm not going to mention any names, who might fit that description. Uh,
Now, listen,
I was referring to the Islanders, actually, but
I know. I know. Listen, like Brock Nelson is also on this list,
but he's
guys.
also in the tournament. So, you
That's
know,
true. Well, but he could still get traded before the deadline post
yo,
tournament.
he could. Whether Lou Lamoriello will actually do that or whether he'll be a buyer again to try to sneak into the playoffs remains to be seen. But what do you think the Flyers will be doing? Do you think they'll be active during the break?
I mean, I think they're going to try. I think, they do have a couple of pieces they could potentially trade. We'll see what happens with Rasmus Ristolainen. He's had a really strong season, bouncing back from the injury he had last year. He was banged up and he's technically supposed to be playing in Four Nations. We'll see what happens with that. My guess is that he'll miss the first game and then play in the rest of the tournament if I were to make a bet. But Scott Lawton is always on the table, and so they've also cleared that cap space with the deal they made with Calgary. Flyers are always looking for a center or a defenseman, so it's possible. But Briere said he's going to only do it for the right deal, right? He's not gonna do it just to make a trade to make a trade.
It's got to be a hockey trade, in other words.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. What about the Anaheim Ducks? They're doing better than most people expected, but they're not really a playoff team this year. Two guys who have been rumored to be traded forever: John Gibson, Trevor Zegras. Your thoughts?
I think Gibson's staying around. I just think like that's just never gonna happen. I also think Zegras is sticking around. I think it would have to be like one of the most blockbuster deals. The Ducks would have to get so much more than we expect for him in return. Because I think, they do have some other young pieces, and they're gonna have more solid draft picks this year too. And they've got a decent prospect pool coming up. So like why burn one of the older younger players who can help mentor and be a leader amongst these younger players here? Like why would you get rid of somebody like that?
Yeah. No, I agree. I think they probably should hold on to those guys, but it, the rumors come up every year and they are still in Anaheim. So that is interesting. Any other, like Vancouver, do you think they're done, or do you think, I mean, they've been so active. What are
Yeah,
they doing? What is the end game here?
I think they need to let it sit for a little bit and decide closer to deadline. I think they've made their big deals, and then anything that they do closer to deadline is going to be a tweak. I just don't think that they need to, because they need time to figure out what they have now with the changes they've made to their team.
And Toronto, who is always active at the deadline.
You know, I think like I mentioned, Scott Laughton for the Flyers. He's always been rumored to get traded to Toronto, but I think they're gonna, as is often the case with them, there's going to be a lot of talk and very little actual action.
It's going to be interesting. We have some exciting hockey hopefully coming up. I'm sure there will be some activity on the trade market over the break. So lots to look forward to for hockey fans. Thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from our hosts, Steele and Flip. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Don't forget, we are here 6 days a week on Locked On NHL, Monday through Saturday. We'll have the Women's Hockey Spotlight with you, Rachel, and Erica Ayala coming up on Saturday. I'll be back on Monday talking to 3 of our local hosts about the biggest stories from around the NHL. Have a great weekend, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.